All right, it is a mild one here in southern Ohio in the late going of 2025. Today I wanted to talk about St. Louis and what the climate is like out there. And I do have a history there. In 95, I moved out there, took a job. I had some really talented people in that office, but wow, they get some wild weather out there. Over here in Ohio, it's just not as volatile. We don't get as many extreme heat waves, not as much tornado risk, and maybe not even as much flooding. But anyway, within a week after arriving out there, we had a hellacious lightning storm, and I had never seen anything like it. But I wanted to, and then of course, they get tornadoes. I know they got torn up. They had a pretty bad tornado when was that? May of 2025, I think it was. But anyway, given that this is a climate related channel with a focus on aerosol masking, I think St. Louis has some interesting characteristics. And the aerosol masking effect, the idea is that the burning of certain fossil fuels, coal being the big one, for coal-fired power plants, this releases these sulfates into the air and they reflect incoming solar radiation and therefore have a cooling effect. So it is really the ultimate inconvenient truth. But one other kind of irony of this is when I took that job in St. Louis, one of my biggest clients was Peabody Coal Company. So, maybe I should give them a call and they can hire me as a spokesperson and I can explain how burning coal is saving the planet. Well, maybe not. Saving the Midwest, sort of. Anyway, that's kind of my intro, and we can look in more detail at some of the data. All right, here we go again with our favorite tool, earthnullschool.net, and enjoy it while you can. You know how Trumpy feels about climate change, because this was developed by some software engineer, and he's pulling data in real time from some of the national NOAA, I guess the NOAA satellites. That's one source. So who knows how long this will last. But anyway, focusing on St. Louis, what I did here is it allows you to go back to a certain date, allows you to go back about 10 years and find out what was happening on that particular date in a particular location. So you can zoom in. And in this case, the hottest day St. Louis has seen since 2013 is 108, and that was on July 22nd of 2017. And it did get up to 108, I think, 2 times in 2012. And 2012, 2011, that's a whole other story. That video, the Great Pivot of 2013, I get into that. But so here we're looking at the sulfur dioxide level on this hot day. And St. Louis has not such a high sulfate level. If you look at what really matters, it doesn't matter so much exactly what the sulfate level is directly overhead, but what are the sulfate levels like in the airstream that is heading towards you. And we're getting, Earth Null School they give you the amount in micrograms per cubic meter. So on this very hot day, see they had kind of a west wind. A lot of these values are maybe on average it's 1, maybe 1.5, I don't know. And I'm sure these coal plants down in East Texas, they definitely help. There's no doubt about it. But I wanted to point out that St. Louis can't compete with us over here in the Ohio Valley. We've got the best amount of sulfate pollution of anybody, at least in North America. And the other thing is it's very consistent over here. That matters too, because the way we're situated, a lot of the coal plants are along the river, and on our hot days, and there are also a fair number in the south, on our hot days the wind's out of the south-southwest, so our airstream is very much aerosol soaked, and that would help explain why we're hitting so few record highs in the summer. And I think Columbus maybe had 3 in the last 13 years. Cincinnati, maybe 3. Peoria, I know, had 1. And I know Indianapolis had 1. And I know Pittsburgh hadn't set any records in the summer over the last 13 years. But St. Louis, I tallied up 11 summer records over the last the last 13 summers. I think they had 2 in 2013, and the other 9 were in the last 10 years. Did I mention Peoria? They had 1 record. My point with all this is there's definitely a correlation between the sulfate level and the number of records that these locations are hitting. And St. Louis is just kind of an in-between location as far as the aerosol masking effect. It's really more like the South. The levels are a little more sporadic down there, and they're hitting similar numbers of records in the summer. In Dallas, kind of in the same category because it's right on the line between low sulfate and high sulfate, and it depends on the wind direction. They had 17 summer records in the last 10 years. A lot of those came in 2023. There was a pretty wicked heat spell in the late summer of 2023. But as I mentioned in my other video, you get out here to Abilene, and they consistently have a lot lower sulfate levels, and they have hit 43 records in the last decade versus Dallas's 17. Amarillo, where's Amarillo? Up here somewhere. I think they had 41. I know it was more than 40. And Corpus Christi, I believe, had 44 summer records. So again, more correlation. And out west, they're hitting all kinds of records. I wanted to go through this chart again. This is where I broke down the high sulfate locations. This is looking at it a little bit differently. In the last 13 years, how many days per year on average has Columbus seen 94 degrees or better? And it turns out only 4 days in the last 13 years. But way back when, 1890 to 1955, long before we had the heat island effect and urban sprawl that Columbus has now, there was a lot. The extreme heat was more extreme back then, and it's really the same thing. All of these I would consider high sulfate, and as you can see, they're not hitting. It's just not as hot when you look at the extreme heat. Now, when you look at more moderate heat, we're getting a lot of that. We get a lot of 90-degree weather. We get all kinds of warm nights. We break records there. But like I said, the sulfates reflect solar radiation. They don't have nearly as much of an effect at night. And they don't have as much of an effect when it's really cloudy either. That seems, these really humid climates, like China. China has the highest sulfate levels on the planet. And you would think that based on that, it would be amazingly cool over there, but they're just kind of warming up. Their heat is kind of pretty much in line with most of the rest of the northern hemisphere, not really above or below. But anyway, I broke these into categories. So the second category, not quite as much aerosol masking effect. And in general, these, at least the last 13 years, were closer to as far as hot days compared to 100 years ago. Kansas City's lagging. They out that way, Iowa and Kansas, they have really underperformed in the heat department the last decade or so. And I can only attribute that to just random luck. And they do have aerosol masking, don't get me wrong. Those East Texas coal plants especially are helping out Omaha, Sioux City, Fort Smith, all these places. But they've also had luck on top of that, especially the last couple years. Charlotte, yeah, back east, you see, they've actually had slightly more hot weather in the last 13 years versus long ago. And here I put St. Louis in the moderate SO2 category. And on this basis, number of days per year that St. Louis is seeing a high of 99 or more, 3.3 in the last 13 years versus 5 back way long ago. They had out that far. The Dust Bowl was pretty intense. So that, although averaged over 66 years or whatever this is, the Dust Bowl really didn't affect this number too much. And one thing I noticed is the hottest it's ever been in St. Louis was 115 in 1954, and the coal plants were just starting to get built about that time. They were built over this way in the eastern Corn Belt. They were built earlier, but those East Texas coal plants and out in western Missouri, they were built at least a decade later, maybe even later than that. But as you can see, these medium sulfate, they're kind of breaking even more or less. And then once you get out to Amarillo, I think we could have put Abilene in this too. It's important to stress that in the last 13 years, they have exceeded, in terms of extreme heat, they are getting more of it than 100 years ago. And the sulfate level is much lower out here. And I'm not saying Dodge City, Valentine, these places, they have some aerosol masking effect too. There's some sulfate in the air, and then just also being relatively close to the region that has a lot of aerosol masking cuts your heat a little bit anyway. Now we get out to Phoenix and it's just getting hotter than all get out. Number of days per year, they were getting 112 degree heat. Used to only get 3 days of that per average. Now they're getting 18, 6 times as much. Since 2020, they've been averaging 28 days. So almost 10 times as much. I think they had 22 record highs in a row last year, or something like that. It's really getting out of hand. And I think maybe I had a couple more for St. Louis, just to track the long-term trends in hot weather. 5-year cumulative total number of days with a high greater than 98. And you see these are 5-year increments. We were coming along the Dust Bowl, it really did shoot up. But there's also quite a bit of hot weather in the 50s, and then the coal plants were built, and it did subdue it quite a bit. although they had 1980 and 1983, they had some hot weather. Then again, 2011, 2012, it did get really hot in St. Louis. Well, it got got really hot a lot of places. You got to watch that video on the Great Pivot, because what it appears that happened is we had clean air mandates to lower sulfates, and we were lowering, and we got to 2011 and we broke below a critical threshold of sulfate, and we lost some of our aerosol masking effect, and the temperatures went way up, especially even more so in 2012. But it appears as though our sulfates came back at some point, because according to Earth Null School, this is 2017, but we have high sulfate levels in the eastern U.S., and the official narrative is that they reduce sulfate levels to almost to nothing, but we seem to have a discrepancy here. I trust Earth Null School, even I guess technically both the data from both kind of come from the government, but this is satellite generated, and I'm sure they assume no one is looking at this. And the climate nerds will never tell you that coal burning over the eastern United States is keeping our summer temperatures relatively subdued. If they said that, it'd be the end of their career. Anyway, I've gone on too long.